Okay, so warm welcome to everyone. Welcome to the 17th lecture in the SOAS World Philosophies lecture series, which we began in January 2021. We've had some very fascinating talks and excellent speaker. And today we have the opportunity to listen to Kai, whose reputation does precedes him. When you think about African ethics, African epistemology, African animal rights, and animal ethics. And so we really are looking forward to this talk. Kai Horsthemke, I hope my pronunciation is right, is a visiting professor at the University of Witwatersrand and also at the German University KU Eichstätt-Ingolstadt, showing that my German is very bad. He is also the author of several monographs, The Moral Status and Rights of Animals, Animals and African Ethics, Animal Rights Education, and Indigenous Knowledge, Philosophical and Educational Considerations. And I'm indeed looking forward to your new book, which you said will be out this year, on the meaning of death. I'm sure there'll be some African and as well as Western perspectives in that book, and I'm really looking forward to reading that. Today you are speaking on a theme that is central to your work. You're speaking on environmental ethics, climate change, and African social epistemology. So we're looking forward to that. We'll give you the stage, take your time, give your talk, and then after that, we'll be able to entertain questions and comments. So I would just ask everyone, as you've already done, please remain muted so that Kai can give his lecture without distractions. And after the lecture, we'll have the opportunity for comments and questions as well. Thank you, Kai. You have our attention.
Right. Thanks very much, Elvis, for the very kind introduction, and also for the invitation to speak as part of the SOAS lecture series, which I think is a hugely important lecture series, and notably or significantly also started during the Corona lockdowns, I should imagine. So it's a nice way of networking and being connected. I'll share my screen. I hope everyone can see this.
Yeah, we can see that. You just make it into a slideshow, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Elvis. Just perhaps before I start, just a few words. I spent probably about 47 years on the African continent, mostly in South Africa, where I also taught at the University of the Witwatersrand until and including 2015. Since 2015, I've been in Germany. I was originally born in Germany, and so I moved back to Germany and have been teaching at the University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt in the south. And your pronunciation, Elvis, was I wouldn't dare to or I wouldn't presume to have a similarly good pronunciation of a foreign language that is foreign to me. And so well done. My topic for today is environmental ethics, climate change, and social epistemology, which combines various ideas that I have developed over the past decade or two. Let me just see if this works. Yeah. Some of the ideas appeared in a book that was published 8 years ago by Palgrave Macmillan on animals in Africa. which has had a very good reception and also very good critical responses by theorists and authors. The second book that I'll be drawing on was published 2 years ago by Lexington Books on Indigenous knowledge, philosophical and educational considerations. So these are the two main works that my talk today. And by the way, I haven't tried this kind of talk before. I haven't timed it, so I'll be keeping an eye on the clock. So it shouldn't take more than 45 minutes, possibly just under, to leave us ample time for discussion, comments, and debate. Okay. The starting point. Sorry, Elvis. Yeah, I see you raise your hand.
No worries, Kai.
Okay, right. My starting point will be or is a quotation I found by Zimbabwean author Chenjerai Hove, who said the following: "We have neither catalogued nature nor pinned it down and preserved it in formaldehyde. We see it differently, speak to and about it differently." We, Hove uses here is obviously the collective African. The question, of course, that this patient raises is whether this is correct, and what the role is that is played by indigenous knowledge systems, for example, traditional environmental or ecological knowledge in this regard. Now, one of the probably most important ideas in African thinking is probably the idea of relationality that appears in ontology, in epistemology, and in ethics. In ontology, it means we're all in this together. Like our being depends on the being of others, and a similar diagnosis can be made with regard to epistemology, knowledge claim. That I know because of other knowers, or I am a knower because of the knowers. My knowing is always related to the knowing of others. Okay, and most famously, this kind of the idea of relationality is probably captured in ethics, and I'm thinking in particular of the Nguni term Ubuntu, which has also made it into the Sotho languages, Boto, and and into like Zimbabwe, where the term would be Unu, but it's also captured in the Egyptian term Ma'at. Okay. I am human because of other humans. So my humanity depends on the humanity of others. I am a person because of other person. Put it even more succinctly, I am because we are. So this kind of the idea of Ubuntu captures the idea of relationality and gives it not only an ethical sense, also an ontological and epistemological sense. So the idea is that there is an important lesson we learned here from African and from other indigenous communities. When I say other indigenous communities, I'm referring, for example, to Native American communities, which have an equivalent to this notion of relationality, Ubuntu. You think, for example, of the Cree concept of Owen, or or the Lakota phrase mitakuye oyasin. Okay, we are all related. Words, we are all in this. Okay. Now, why this is important with regard to the topic that I'm addressing today is that this intersectionality or this interconnectedness is visible in a variety of lessons. Okay. For example, if we study infectious diseases, we find that 75% of these diseases are actually theonotic or zoonotic. They originate within non-human animals. The recent pandemic is a famous example of that, where it was found to originate in the Asian markets, so to. Before that, we had the manifestation of the Ebola virus in West Africa, which is back to flying bats and wildlife, and the consumption thereof, thus making this decision onto species. Another example of this kind of intersectionality or our interconnectedness is also visible in examining the impact of the initial global corona lockdown. For example, some of you may recall when some governments really ordered a draconian lockdown. For example, in Italy, there was a kind of wildlife returned to the canals of Venice. To rivers within Asia. Also, wolves returned to southern Germany because of this kind of circumscription of the or temporary circumscription of the human impact on the environment. So nature almost breathed a sigh of relief. Many might have interpreted. Thirdly, of course, there's the implications to be drawn from Russia's war against the Ukraine, and especially implications with regard to the significance of renewable energies. We found that we're way too dependent on fossil fuels from both Russia and the Ukraine. So, talking for Germany, at least, there is this realization now that we should invest far more, to a far greater extent, in renewable energies like wind energy, solar energy. And this also has a huge impact, of course, or huge implications, major implications for the African continent. I'm thinking, for example, of the democratic transition in South Africa in 1994, when Nelson Mandela became president, and he was advised to invest in solar energy. Now, Mandela at that point said this would be too expensive because he had made the election promise of building 5 million RDP, reconstruction and development homes, and that investment in solar energy would take important monies away from it. Of course, one can respect and understand why he embraced or took the stance that he did. In retrospect, especially looking at what South Africa is going through, or has been going through for the last decade or so, with the load shedding, with the huge problems in meeting the sort of energy demands. A greater investment in renewable energy, renewable resources like solar and wind energy would have been advisable. And finally, of course, another example of intersectionality or interconnectedness are, what could be called the economic, environmental, and also the well-being or health benefits we as humans draw from diminishing reliance on animal products. Okay, and perhaps we can say a little more about that later. Still on a fairly general note, when we look at global climate change, we find that it is clearly anthropogenic or human-made. The climate crisis, human impact on the environment is probably one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest priority of the research we can do as academics, as scientists, as philosophers, as educationists. Namely to arrest and possibly reverse or try to reverse the present decline. Because after all, this is the only planet we've got. We don't have all that much longer. And in the very pessimistic analysis of many significant scientists, if we look at the history of humankind, 24-hour development, we're this close. We're microseconds away from extinction, and this should really, give us pause of what we should do, how we should react. Now, of course, none of this has really helped with the kind of truth denialism that has characterized only academia, but political, where the value and significance of truth, for the longest time, possibly central preoccupation of philosophers, has in recent years come under attack. Okay, it's not only climate change denialism that has cast doubt on the significance. But also, of course, in most countries there would have been something like coronavirus denialism. And then, of course, the usual suspects that within academia we've encountered for a fair number of years. Among these is, of course, radical constructivism, perhaps other forms of constructivism, not all constructivism, but radical constructivism in particular locates or denies an objectivity or universality of truth. The truth is essentially a human local construct. Okay? I'll talk a bit more about that later. There are also, as you may well be aware, sort of various forms of postmodernism targeted this of truth, the conception of truth as a sort of universal notion, as objectively valid or as an objective phenomenon. And then, of course, we only need to look at the debates preceding Brexit, the woeful reign of the of Donald Trump as American president. In other words, the alternative fact lobbies that were part and parcel of the campaigns, and also, what has become known as the kind of as post where we have moved beyond truth. The result has been a pernicious relativism that I think is hugely, hugely problematic. And I'll say a bit more about that towards the end. Now, to get to the heart of this presentation, namely animals and the environment in Africa. Now, I think it's clear and beyond doubt that the crass objectification of nature is predominantly a Western or Northern phenomenon. Okay, and I think we would all agree that African continents have been for the longest time with living with nature, rather than perceiving it as something to be vanquished and dominated, as traditionally been the case in the North. So from this point of view, I think Hove's analysis or Hove's diagnosis would certainly be correct. However, I think one could say that traditional African communalists or relational orientations also have very little in common, kind of egalitarianism that is characteristic of animal rights, the animal liberation, the deep ecology, also radical environmentalism. Okay, and this is where this is the kind of one of the central pillars of my concern. Now, of course, one could argue that there is no single unified African ontology or epistemology, moral outlook, and I think that's correct. But there are nonetheless certain core ideas, striking commonalities, and also shared concerns. Among these are the so-called ontological hierarchy, which an ethical hierarchy, the idea of totems and taboos, and the rituals of sacrifice and slaughter that are manifest all over the African continent, and more about those. If we look, for example, at the hierarchy of beings, logical hierarchy, we find that this is a hierarchical arrangement that has God on top. I've only used the Nguni or Zulu language here, Unkulunkulu or Umvelikani, the one who emerged first. Okay, God would be on the highest rung, followed, of course, by the spirits and the ancestors, or Amadlozi, or living dead. These are again Nguni terms that are in use here, and I'm aware that these equivalents, concept equivalents, are the African continent. This sort of level or rung of the ancestors or living dead, the Amadlozi and Apapansi, will then be followed by the level where human beings reside or into, and finally below human beings is the rest of animate and inanimate creation, including non-human animals, plants, the environment. The role allocated to human beings by the divinity or by God is to act responsibly and morally. Okay, so the implication, of course, is that the moral responsibilities and duties we have with regard to the non-human environment, the ecosphere, are primarily duties to God, but they're also duties to the ancestors. Okay, who play a kind of connecting role between us living beings and the Creator God. And these duties we have towards the environment, towards the ecosphere, are of course also duties to the rest of creation. The question, however, is whether these are direct or indirect. And my suspicion is that these duties that we have to the environment are really only indirect. But our duties are primarily to the Creator God in respect of his. So we shouldn't despoil his creation, meaning animals, meaning the environment, the sphere, the ecosphere. Because if we do that, we fall short on our commitments or our responsibility towards God's creation. It renders our obligations towards non-human nature an indirect duty rather than a direct duty. Now, what about morality? Morality is essentially a matter of human relations. Okay, human relationships that we have with God, with the ancestors, but also with non-human creation. Okay, and it should be clear from what I've said is that the hierarchy of beings invariably places animals and the non-human environment in an inferior position. Humans. Okay, the ancestors are living dead. Constitute, or they have a very, very important or vital role in the lives of Africans. They act, as I said, the link between God and living human beings, consulted regularly during ceremonies, weddings, moving into a new home or abode, ceremonies during which animals are routinely. Now, I want to refer to a really fascinating person many of you may be aware of already, and this is the South African sage, intellectual, Sanusi or uppermost Sangoma or traditional healer. He was also an artist, a sculptor, author of some fascinating books, of which was Indaba My Children, which was a history of his Zulu people. And he was Edo Mutwa, who died at the age of 98. 20. His book, Luana, The Animal, was published in 1990. And some fascinating insights into the role that both free roaming animals and animal companions play in our meaning in the lives of Africa. Okay. Now, when Mutwa passed away in 2020, an obituary was penned by a doctoral fellow at Wits University in Johannesburg, Sinetemba Makani. And I've just replicated or reproduced parts of this really moving and wonderful obituary here, which is subheaded New Ways of Knowing. Now he refers to Credo Mutwa as Umkhulu, Umkhulu meaning grandfather. So this is a very endearing form of responding to him. The kind of veneration the older generation commands as younger. Umkhulu broadened the view of Africa. In his work, we were exposed to a type of knowledge that had been. He taught us, for example, that South Africa's history did not begin in 1602, when Jan van Riebeeck hit our shores and the colonization project began, But instead that we have a long legacy of philosophy and medicine interrupted by this colonization. Now he anticipates what I shall later refer to as indigenous. I'm going to come back to this idea, but first I want to say a bit more about Mutwa, the kind of wisdom, kind of foresight, or anticipatory knowledge Mutwa had. If we look at the following slides, for example, this is a set of sculptures done by Mutwa in the 1970s, titled King Kandakulu and the Gods. You'll see King Kandakulu on the right-hand side in conversation with the gods and discussing his sexually transmitted disease with the gods. Okay, now this was prior to the spread of HIV/AIDS. So it's, there's a huge amount of foresight. What is also interesting is the almost animal-like characteristics of the gods with whom he has this conversation. And this is an idea that also pervades some of his written work. There's another incredible artwork that he did in 1979, to prefigure the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York in 2001. I haven't been able to trace it, but this would have been an amazing piece of foresight, coming from Mutwa 22 years before the actual event. Now, what about his book, Isilwana the Animal? Mutwa says that in the past, African people did not regard themselves as being above the animals, birds, fish, and trees. And in a whole series of chapters, looks at roaming animals and the roles these animals play in the lives of Africans, but also domesticated. If we look carefully at what we're saying, find that so-called value and the basis of respect for wild animals, like domestic animals, is largely determined by their function in the lives of human beings, the purpose, the use to which they are put by human beings, which is more often than not guided by superstition. Okay, so for example, cats are valued because they keep evil little creatures like the tokoloshi or mantindane at bay. They protect human beings against these evil. Sheep are valued because their brains can be used to counteract or combat madness or insanity within human beings. Okay, and I mean, the examples can be, there are many more examples of the value and purpose that animals have with regard to lives. So one could say that largely the value that animals have is to a large extent an instrumental value. And this is also borne out if we look at totemism and taboos. Like, you'll be aware that the totem animal, there is if a particular creature is a totem animal, there's a taboo on killing or eating it. But of course, these taboos that are placed on killing, ingesting animals are frequently arbitrary, because we find that one clan's totem animal often turns out to be another his favorite bush. Okay, so again, there's a kind of arbitrary. Look at popular thought and continent, we find that a lot of this is also egalitarian, anthropocentric, human-centered, meaning that such thought and practice is human interests. Now, I think three rather broad tendencies can be diagnosed. Is in the first instance, is a more or less outspoken human sense, more or less qualified endorsement of human moral superiority. In the literature, in the literature of the African continent, right? In second instance, there is a lip service to environmental or animal friendliness, but ultimately, morally, humans remain the measure of all things, center of all consideration. And this is, for example, also noticeable in defenses or so-called environmental or animal-friendly defenses of Ubuntu and Ukama. Okay. We look at this term, Ubuntu. I'm human because of other humans. You know, there is that explicit human-centeredness there already. And even the Shona term, Ukama, meaning relatedness, draws from Hama, the kind of closeness we feel. And that is drawn especially from the closeness we have with an animal like a goat. If we milk the goat, why do we milk the goat? For human purposes, essentially. Okay, so even this kind of ukama, this kind of closeness, ama, has an anthropology. Finally, of course, there is amongst African scholars, and this is, and I've noticed that with a great personal joy, is a development over the recent years where there is an outright rejection of anthropocentrism, and where there are explicitly pro-animal attitudes, where there is a kind of acknowledgement of the inherent value of nature and the environment. And I think when I published my book on animals and African ethics, this kind of third group was not very present or manifest. It has only come to the fore, I suppose, over the last 7 to 8 years. Now, to get to the other pillar of my talk here, namely the idea of has been already in the written by Makanya on with regard to that among the conceptual and practical results, establishing environmental ecological awareness very often is indigenous or local knowledge, and the emphasis on sustainable development. Now, the notion of indigenous knowledge as a phenomenon, of course, indigenous knowledge has been with us since the development or evolution of Homo sapiens, as we know ourselves. The concept of indigenous knowledge is a fairly recent one. Okay, that has only been with us for the last years, and with increasing importance and significance within academia. So buzzwords like indigenous knowledge, technologies, have characterized special issues, conferences, and also, of course, another buzzword has been sustainable development. And I now wish to question or interrogate both of these. For example, what is meant by indigenous knowledge? What is meant by alternative or diverse epistemologies? These terms really make sense. Okay, what is knowledge? What is epistemology? Okay, and it's perhaps telling that in most defenses of these notions, there is not a clarification of what authors actually mean by knowledge or epistemology. Usually defined is the term indigenous or traditional or local. Okay, but there's hardly ever any engagement with what is actually meant by knowledge, what is meant by epistemology. Okay. Now, if we look at this concept of knowledge in particular, we find that in the English language there are three kinds of knowledge. There's knowledge as acquaintance, knowing a person, a place, knowing a language, okay, or knowing a culture. Secondly, there's practical knowledge how, knowing how to do certain things, like knowing how to bake bread, knowing how to play a particular musical instrument, knowing how to drive a car, how to ride a bike. But importantly, there's, in the third place, there's knowledge that, additional knowledge, or theoretical knowledge that. Okay. Now, if we look at what knowledge that actually involves, three components. There's the belief component. I cannot know that something is. I don't also believe it. So I have to at least believe that is it. Okay, in order to. But believing something isn't enough. Be more. My belief has to be justified. Okay. If my belief is not justified, I cannot speak of knowledge. Even a justified belief is not sufficient for knowledge. Why? Because I may have a justified belief that is nonetheless false. Okay, so my justified belief also has to be true in order to mount knowledge. Okay, so what this gives us is the classical definition of knowledge as justified true belief. Now, there have been, like philosophers among you may say, look, there has been Edmund Burke and his influential paper of 1963 established once and for all that that justified true belief is not a sufficient condition. In other words, that the characteristics of justification belief may all be met without our claims amounting to. That's fine. I don't want to discuss or enter that debate here. I don't think it's necessary. I do think what Etier's counterexamples don't establish is that none of these. He fails to show that any of these components, belief, truth, and justification, cannot be necessary. So the necessity of these remains in place. So what does all this have to do with indigenous knowledge? Now, if we call something indigenous knowledge, what do we mean? Are we talking about knowledge by acquaintance? Are we talking about practical knowledge, or are we talking about propositional knowledge? Okay. If we mean knowledge by acquaintance, I'm sure there could be indigenous knowledge in regard. Okay. There is indigenous acquaintance of a geographical terrain, of a language, of people, that is not shared by non-indigenes, indigenes, okay? Now, what about practical knowledge? I think perhaps also a case could be made for practical knowledge to be indigenous, that there are skills, that there is knowledge that pertains particular geographically or historically defined group of people. The problem comes in when we refer to indigenous knowledge as positional knowledge, because that means that there could be something like indigenous propositional knowledge. I think this is hugely problematic. There could be indigenous beliefs. Could there be indigenous justice? Could there be indigenous truth? Okay. The problems here are obvious. If we allow for this, we have no way of distinguishing between what is science and what is not science. We have no knowledge of distinguishing between knowledge and superstition. Okay, and it also paves the way for an all-out relativism. Okay, if there is something like indigenous truth, that would mean that your truth may not be my truth. Okay. It relativizes a lot of knowledge claims and truth claims, with all the logical problems this entails, which I don't want to go into. Just a few words with regard to sustainable development. Problem with sustainable development, I mean, we all understand where this idea comes from, that we shouldn't exploit resources beyond capacity, that our exploitation of natural resources should be sustainable. Okay. Now, the problem with an emphasis on sustainable development is this kind of neoliberal obsession with growth. Still, it's inherent anthropocentrism. Okay? In other words, if it is, it stays. We benefit from it. Likely, that particular practice or mode of oppression will continue. So it's unlikely, this idea, the whole idea of sustainable development is unlikely fundamental rethinking, a long-term solution to the environmental predicament that we. Okay, so often these terms are used in tandem. The idea of indigenous knowledge for sustainability, and I don't deny that it looks that it even looks promising. My worry is that it's fraught with problems of the kind that I mentioned. Problems, logical problems, also logical and primarily ethical. So what can be said about indigenous knowledge and logical progress? I want to mention just 3 examples where I think there is some promise here. For example, the insights of sangomas or traditional healism. Okay? Not to harvest the bark of a tree if it means that in the absence of bark, die. And also the insight to only take from a particular natural resource, like a plant or a shrub or a bush or a herb, if there is at least 10 times as much in the immediate environment. So there is a kind of sustainability idea here, okay, that however has a hugely important logical function. You might also have heard of the Koba cactus by the San people in Namibia, kind of cactus which has throughout the history of the San been ingested as a kind of energy resource. It's a kind of practice that, if it is chewed, it quells any kind of hunger, it quells thirst, it enables people to to cover huge distances geographically without eating, without drink. Okay. Now, when it was found out that that the coba cactus does have, imagine that immediately Western or Northern pharmaceutical concerns converged and wanted to patent the coba cactus. Now, fortunately, the San community had some very wily advocates and lawyers on its part to ensure that there would be a kind of deal that this formerly indigenous knowledge of the San community meant that they also kept having a kind of stake in the commercialization of their cactus, the coba cactus, meaning that they would still reap financial benefits from the marketing of cactus, especially for the American diet, the diet market. Another insight I briefly want to mention is the practice by Ugandan chili farmers who as farmers faced the huge problem of marauding elephants in their land, destroying trees, destroying plants, making vast land uninhabited. And so what these farmers discovered is that elephants don't like chili. So by planting chili hedges around their property and grazing lands and where they grow their vegetables and plants, that meant keeping elephants at bay, okay, while also providing them with an additional source of income, namely very fine chili. Okay. Okay, this is the last slide. What do we make of diverse knowledge? The idea of diverse knowledges, and it's not a diversity in terms of truth, but it's rather a diversity in terms of practical priorities, epistemic and ethical priorities. Now, given the history of colonization and colonialism on the African continent, it stands to reason priorities Africans have are related, are geographically and historically related to this kind of history and experience of colonialism. Now, this does not mean that there is a kind of diversity of truth, diversity of knowledges, that we have certain epistemic priorities or truth functional priorities that concerns on the African. This does not support epistemological relativism, moral or cultural relativism. It does not support alternative or the notion of different regimes of truth, as Foucault has said. And I'm very heartened by the fact that in recent years there has been an increasing awareness among African scholars of the untenability of a rigidly species-governed us against them thinking. Us, human beings, against them, non-human nature. That, and also the realization that anthropocentrism has many relevant features, ethnocentrism, and that speciesism is relevantly like racism. So if we take what underlies African relationality, I am because we are, and we extend this beyond the human realm I would suggest that there's ample cause for cautious optimism. Now, of course, one might argue that our task as philosophers and also as human beings is still a formidable, because it requires imagination, it requires intellectual honesty, and also practical consistency. In other words, a more radically egalitarian relation. What this means really is also that we have to realize that our species, our human species, is really one species that the world can well do without. In fact, the world would flourish in the absence of human being. And if we bear this in mind, this is something that should inspire in us, humans, lasting of humility. Okay. And I thank you for listening and have over.
Thank you so much, Kai. That was a richly packed lecture with so many interesting concepts and arguments from the African perspective on our relationship with other beings, human and non-human. And yeah, I thoroughly did enjoy that. We'll open it up now for questions and comments. If you can please raise your digital hand, and you'll be called on to ask your questions, or if you want to put it on the chat, please do that as well. Yeah, my colleague, Dr. Andrew Hines, please go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, Professor Horsthemke, and apologies for coming in a bit late. Thank you for the bit of your talk I heard anyway. What I wanted to ask, you kind of started to speak to this at the end, but I wanted to ask about, just broadly speaking, how does Indigenous knowledge, the way you're articulating it here, relate to something like the epistemological assumptions that something like the Paris Agreement might define sustainable development? So kind of, is there a relationship? Can there be a relationship between these epistemological assumptions? Does it even make sense to think about it in that way? That was my question.
Okay. It's that's an interesting question. I mean, because one might say, and this is indeed an argument that has been forward by a lot of scholars, and I'm thinking of feminist scholars like Sandra Harding, my colleague Leslie Lagrange at Stellenbosch University, environmental philosophy, that all knowledge is indigenous. Okay. And so if this is true, then the knowledge that goes into the Paris Agreement will have a strongly indigenous flavor as well, will have a local flavor as well. But my concern is that ultimately, the notion of indigenous knowledge makes limited sense. Okay, we can make sense of it in terms of acquaintance type knowledge, skill type or practical knowledge, and perhaps also in terms of beliefs, or the beliefs that inform a certain outlook. Okay, but when it really comes to the notions of justification, epistemic justification, and truth, reality, to hold on to something like indigenous, the notion of indigeneity would probably be more problematic than solve any problem.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kai. Any other questions? Yeah, please go ahead, Imogen. Yeah, let's go ahead.
Hi. Oh, sorry, I'll put my camera on. Thank you so much. I missed a bit of that talk, but it was so interesting, and I'm really glad I did manage to make it. But I was just wondering, I suppose, I guess this is partly a question, but partly a comment, about what you were just saying about, it seemed to be conceptualizing indigenous knowledge and making it into a concept that is Indigenous knowledge and that being problematic. I'm not sure if I've misunderstood there, but that's kind of what I got from it. And I was just thinking that was really interesting because on the first slide, there was that quote that we were to think about, where I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the person who said it, but it was about not conceptualizing nature. And I just thought that was a really interesting connection there.
Okay.
We're talking about, well, can you conceptualize Indigenous knowledge as Indigenous knowledge? And then saying, well, one of the ideas of Indigenous knowledge is not to conceptualize nature and the planet. And yeah, I don't really know if that's a, like I said, question or comment, not sure, but I just thought that was maybe an interesting connection to draw there. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Imogen. To be honest, I'll have to think a bit about that. I think the one concern I have is that look, I mean, we do distinguish, or perhaps we need to distinguish between Indigenous knowledge as kind of as a phenomenon, which, as I mentioned, is probably as old as our existence as Homo sapiens is. But as a concept, it's far more recent, and I think there is a case to be made that it has been used with increasing popularity as a concept over the last 30 years or so. But this doesn't address the observation you make. But I promise you, I'll think carefully about that, and especially try to relate it to Hove's view, because I think this would be hugely interesting.
Oh, great. Well, I mean, I'll be thinking about it too. So thank you.
Thanks, Imogen. I mean, for me, it's the sort of dichotomy that exists between theory and action, particularly in talking about animal ethics, animal rights, respect for nature, and there's a lot of sort of talk going on, I would say. But when you think about the action in terms of the way pharmaceutical companies use non-human beings in the African sense, everything is a being. The way large food companies produce so much, if you think about the waste, the food waste and pharmaceutical waste that takes place on a daily basis. It seems humans are like children who love toys. They just want to have as much of nature kept somewhere so that they know they are safe. So in most cases, this sort of ontology of displacement, of taking more than we need from every other being except ourselves, well, even ourselves in some cases, shows that we may not really be so committed to treating every other being besides ourselves with the respect and value that they deserve. I mean, it's just a side comment, I guess. Just thinking aloud from everything you've said and what we can learn from Indigenous knowledge systems in dealing with this terrible issue. Amara, please go ahead with your question.
Okay, thank you very much for your thought-provoking lecture. I need a clarification which would enable me to follow up with a follow-up question. I want to understand your position on the role of animal ethics or animal rights within the African ethics discourse. So I'm not clear on that. I'm sorry, I actually joined the lecture late if you had already said something on this, I would also like you to make some clarification. Then I can, if there is time, I can ask a follow-up question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Esther. Yeah, I think three broad. I'm repeating a bit, what I said in my talk already. I think three broad tendencies can be diagnosed or analyzed within African. First, that there is really very, very strong and explicit anthropocentrism manifest, okay? Unapologetically human-centered. Humans are above non-human nature, and if not justified in exploiting human nature, at least having license, in certain parameters, sustainable development. Okay, but an outspoken or explicit anthropocentrism. Second category, and practice, I guess, would be that there is a kind of acknowledgement of the value, or that there's a kind of lip service to the value, or also to the inherent or intrinsic value of non-human nature. But if we dig a bit deeper, and here I'm thinking of the work, for example, of my colleague working there, Bessa, working there, he'll reject the notion of anthropocentrism. If we dig a bit deeper, we find that ultimately there is still a predominantly instrumental view of non-human nature within this kind of. It's only on the third group of thinkers where there is this explicit disavowal of anthropocentrism. Okay, where there is this explicit embrace of the kind of inherent or intrinsic value of non-human, with all that it requires of us, not only conceptually but also practically, changing our lifestyles to accommodate. I hope that's addressed.
Thank you so much for the clarification, but I think I'm having some issues here. From my own perspective and from the Igbo culture where I come from, we talk about interrelationality, for example, which is one of the principles of African ethics. We are not just talking about just the humans. I could remember when I joined, you were talking about hierarchy of beings. Humans are in communication, in relationship with other beings. And that calls for respect, that calls for recognition. And for me, that also accommodates animals. Yes, humans were placed above animals, just like other beings were placed above humans. So that humans were placed above animals does not mean that they should undermine animals in their relationship. All these things, they constitute a kind of a whole where an interaction between these beings, produces what someone like Mez would call produces a kind of harmony. So for me, it doesn't mean that the African worldview is too anthropocentric, or is man-centered. Let me use that word. Here there is a relationship. We are all working together to achieve something. We are all in a relationship. You can't overlook the other, because once you drop the other, there will be a kind of disharmony. And that disharmony will create something very dangerous to the productivity, to the relationship, to the friendliness of the whole. That in the second one where you talked about I'm trying to remember the second point you made, where you talked about spaceship or something. I'm also having issue with that one, you know, just like in other part of the world where who believe that maybe eating animals and using them for sacrifices and rest of them, just like in China, in Europe, and some part of Europe and rest of them, is something that is traditionally required in a way. But we believe that these animals serve these purposes, and such purposes also contribute to the internal working of the system. That is the belief here. But it does not that does not undermine the role they play in the hierarchy of beings. And also, when you even think about this thing more, you find out that, for example, when Africa were colonized by the Europeans, that brought in Christianity. In the Bible, you see where animals are used for sacrifice. Majority of the Africans today that treat animals the way they do is because of these foreign religions that conceive animals as something that is far below humans. But when you come to the African ethics or within the African traditional belief system, you find that is a different ball game altogether. That being said, another aspect, this is not my comments actually. When you talk about African ethics, especially the idea of personhood that scholars like Menkiti, Gaikai and rest of them have written on, you find out that's why it seems like animals are being left out, like in the work of Menkiti's account of normative personhood, is that when you talk about the idea, you are talking about the idea of a person, and an animal is not a person. Although that does not mean that we should treat them somehow or we should marginalize them or trample upon them. No, but the idea of personhood within the African ethics talks about how a person could be morally virtuous, not about how animals could be morally virtuous. And I found out that within some literatures on animal ethics, that this has been interpreted to mean that African ethics is man-centered. African ethics undermines animal rights. For me, which I think is a quick reading of African ethics. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, there's a huge amount that I could speak now, but I think I'll just restrict myself to one or two comments. Thanks very much for this elaborate irrigation. With regard to Menkiti, I think you know, I've obviously got huge problems with Menkiti's account of personhood, because it also disregards certain human beings, like very young human beings who are not yet persons. And I suppose, you know, people who fall out of personhood in later life because of certain inabilities that manifest themselves that would qualify them as, you know, take senility or senile dementia, Alzheimer's, or and I think it's you know, his account of personhood. Again, we could say, look, it's an account of personhood. That's fine, and personhood doesn't constitute the whole of moral realm. So from that point of view, you know, it's problematic. But I nonetheless think that Menkiti's account of personhood is, and someone like Jeche's account comes closer to capturing. But of course, it also means that if we include certain you know, human beings as persons like, with certain mental incapacities, or very young human beings as persons, then what prevents us from including certain non-humans with relevantly similar ability? With regard to the notion of that hierarchy, this ontological hierarchy, is not an anthropocentric one. I mean, that's a debate I've had with various sort of colleagues over the years. I'm not swayed by that argument. I think there is, we're certainly, in terms of our cultural practice, many of these practices are essentially they're instrumentalized. Even though there is this sort of lip service to harmony and avoidance of disharmony, ultimately, if you analyze these practices, the eating of animal flesh, farming with animals, using animals as experimental resources, clothing, etc. Like all these are part and parcel of making life better or improving life for us as human beings. And I think to deny that is problematic and ultimately wrong.
Thank you, Kai. Yeah, I mean, it's a protracted debate, and also, I mean, within African philosophical thought, that there are clear indications and of ideas about the non-human person, of animals who are, for example, revered within specific traditions and not killed because they take up the status of personhood, and of course of infants, for example, who are obviously seen as persons, particularly from the idea of rebirth or reincarnation in the Yoruba culture. For example, when someone is named Babatunde, or which of course is you find in many other traditions, that person is not just seen as a child, but a rebirth of an ancestor. So obviously, Menkiti's philosophy of personhood, it's a classical, important one, but it's also kind of incomplete when you think about the broad range of personhood within African traditions as well. Adewale Owoseni, please go ahead with your question. For some reasons, we can't hear you.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah. You're unmuted, but I'm not sure why we still can't hear you. Adewale, would you like to put your question in the chat quickly? If there's one more question, we can quickly take that maybe before Adewale types on the chat. Any other questions? Amara, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your response. I want to ask, what are African principles for environmental ethics? Thank you.
Yeah, that's that's a wonderful question. I would say that the essence included in the African notion of relationality. I am because we are. I think if we really take this seriously and extend it beyond the human realm, this would really give us the kind of egalitarian relationalism and this kind of thoroughgoing striving towards harmony that would be incompatible with a kind of deep ecology or perhaps a kind of radical environmentalism, and especially with regard to to turning the ship around, from the perhaps doing something in terms of the climate crisis that I am because we are all in this together, right? I think there's a huge promise in that notion of relationality that we can draw on.
Thanks, Kai. So I think we may have lost Adewale. Okay, yeah, sorry. I think there's a question now on the chat. Let's see. Are you able to see that, Kai?
Yes. The question is, I'll read it aloud for everyone. Thanks very much, Adewale, and it's very nice to meet you virtually after all these years. Do you consider language as a sort of challenge for making sense of the complexity of multi-species engagement, which is implied through your Sterling presentation? Consider that the approximations of insights, values, or understanding is that incomplete, or is that?
Yeah, I think the key point is about the language issue.
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right. There we go. I consider that the approximations of insights, values, or understanding about nature is especially captured in human language. Yeah. I think ultimately, perhaps that's what we need to face. I'm wondering what the implications would be. I mean, if it is the case, which seems to be that we as human beings, normal paradigmatic human beings, being language users, being able to philosophize, being able to reconsider our motives, always has a kind of linguistic component. I'm just trying to pursue this. Yeah. Okay. Do you think we should begin to imagine a multi-species language for engaging human and non-human relations? Wow. I think there would be a fascinating topic for a whole conference. Certainly. What would constitute an equivalent of language, and what credibility and on what grounds we should incorporate other, say, non-human language. Okay. Multi-species language. I mean, yeah, like I said, it's this would be a wonderful topic for a conference. It would be.
Yeah, I completely agree, Kai. It's a very interesting thing to think through and to ponder about. We can take one more question from sorry, just Abiodun. Yeah, please go ahead. Abiodun, can you hear us? We can't seem to hear you.
Can you hear me clearly now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I really appreciate the talk, and I did join late, but then my reaction is just coming from this last question, talking about the need or perhaps the possibility of multi-species language. One thing that I have noticed over time is that when environmental ethicists are trying to put out some sort of theories, I mean, perhaps the need to consider non-humans. Most of the times, the language that is coming out now is that we are trying to switch away from anthropocentric languages that we've been using to the detriment of non-humans. We're now switching it back to non-humans and other species. I take, for instance, I have seen works now that would make it prominent now that the skin, the skin of the earth is the soil. Or perhaps you could hear words saying that, oh, waters have eyes and they could see. And I'm kind of wondering, just going in line with this, the need for multi-species language, that if we keep attempting to use anthropocentric concepts for non-humans and other species, are we not getting ourselves into another sort of problem? Because I've seen, yesterday I was having a talk with a natural scientist, and it was put out there that there is this particular weed, Japanese knotweed, that weed is an invasive weed, and I mean, its resilience in the face of climate change makes it very important for us to study. So, I mean, they've studied that particular plant to the point of understanding the way it could be invasive and resilient at the same time. So using human concepts for that particular weed and perhaps helping us to appreciate that. So while it has its own merits, but I'm just wondering if it will not lead us into another crisis later on. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I think we could spend 2-3 hours talking about this issue. I think it's not, when we talk about weeds as invasive and resilient, we don't insult the weeds. Because they're not going to hold it against us. If we use racist or sexist or gender insensitive language, we do insult people, and that's why there's a premium on changing our language in this regard. However, I think a strong case can be made for changing at least some of our language. Let's talk about animal flesh and not meat. Okay, let's talk about the individual animals that are killed and not pork and mutton and beef. Okay, let's talk about companion animals rather than pets. Let's talk about let's try to avoid terminology like pests without if we are unprepared to use the same a word for industrial human polluters, because all these terms, all this terminology objectifies non-human nature. And I think I think part of the process to get away from this kind of exploitative attitude is to is to attempt to get away from this kind of objective. Just see Andrew's. I'd like to think so, Andrew. Yeah. If it does ultimately, that's an empirical matter, clearly, but.
Yeah. Very interesting. The language dimension, definitely something to think about. Also because within African traditions, you find non-human beings, water bodies, plants, trees. In many ways, there are these historical evidences of some at least being treated like persons. You have medicine men and women speaking with trees, and before taking some leaves or some stem from it and things like that. So it's not going to be a new terrain to explore. We'll be exploring some much more deeper terrain even within indigenous societies and cultures, I would say. I think we will draw the curtains here. Amara, would you ask a final question, and then we'll call it a day there. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, actually, it's not a question. I wanted to comment on the multi-species language that the last person asked about, and I actually appreciate the speaker's response. When you talk about language, I'm thinking that one might argue that animals do have their own language, but the problem there is, how do we humans understand their own language? Then when you ask these questions, although within the African cultural space, some people have made claims that we actually understand the animal language, or we actually understand plants' language. But majority of us humans, we do not understand that language. So when you think about it this way, you find out that when you talk about language, we are the ones that create this language. And just like the speaker has said, it's just for us to extend our language in such a way that we eliminate those languages that are biased towards animals, those languages that are biased towards the environment. But changing a language altogether, like the person that posed the question is trying to claim, is something very difficult to do, because we do not understand the animal language. The only thing we can do as humans is to expand our language horizon in such a way that when we speak about animals and the environment, we speak about them in a respectful, accommodating way. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, Amara. Thanks so much, Kai. It's always interesting to have conversations with you, or to read your articles or your books. And obviously that's exactly what has happened now. We can have this conversation for some more hours. So thank you so much for creating the time to give this 17th lecture. And we hope you all enjoy the weekend and the second half of the year, because I think officially the first half just ended. So take care, everyone. See you in September. Usually we will not have lectures for July and August. We hope that everyone can enjoy their summer or their break. And we'll be back in September, where we're beginning with Sikh philosophy. So looking forward to that. We'll send out the poster just before the lecture. Thank you all for joining. Thank you so much, Kai, once again, and enjoy the weekend, everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Elvis. Thanks for all for attending and for the fruitful interaction. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.